Good day, and welcome back to our course on theology and humor. Today we're starting with the early church. And as we look at the early church, we've got to put it in context of Roman comedy. So when we see Roman comedy, we see both Greek and Roman. And there's this kind of debauched old Aristophanes and some of the other kind of phallic comedies, Dionysian comedies that come out at this time. And so the early church fathers are going to respond to that and resist it in many ways. Now, the next thing we see is we go through looking at bread and circuses. This is how the populace was entertained. They're amused. It's very much like watching Netflix today. We don't do anything profitable with our lives, but just want to be amused. In fact, the word amuse means inspiration, and a means not. And so when you're amused, you're without inspiration. You're not thinking for yourselves. And so the church is recognizing this during the comedy. How we go next, though, to one of the great movies of all time. And this is Richard Lester's A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. As you remember, something familiar, something peculiar, something for everyone, a comedy tonight. And so this is what Rome is celebrating. Rome is laughing around. But the next thing we see is that they begin to collect jokes. And all of the kind of Roman jokes are there. There's this kind of great joke book, which is called the Philogelos. And it's the love of laughter, philo and gelos, laughter and love put together. And it's one of the oldest existing collection of jokes. In the 4th century, it appears with all of hundreds of jokes. And there are categories like teachers and professors, which are really easy to kind of mock, ugly wives, farts, dunces, and a really strange one about lettuce that I'm not even going to try to explain. But there's one joke that's very familiar to an old Monty Python sketch. If you remember, John Cleese brings in his dead parrot that he just bought at a pet store. And this one in the old group of jokes is about a man complaining that the slave he just bought is dead. And the seller responds, well, when he was with me, he never did any such thing. And so basically he's saying, yeah, the slave is no more. The slave has ceased to be. The slave is a stiff. Now we find another joke next in a misogynist who is attending the burial of his wife. She just died. And someone comes up to him and says, who is it that rests in peace here? And he answers, me, now that I'm rid of her. And so you see the misogyny, you see this kind of dark humor that comes out against others. There's also that great joke that we find that's been told in other places where the Apostle Paul kind of source is all Cretans are liars, says Epimenides the Cretan. And so if a Cretan says all Cretans are liars, are you to believe him? Is that a lie or is that the truth? But the next thing we go to is one of the great jokes that was actually used with Augustus Caesar and became Freud's favorite joke just because of the play on sex. But it seems like that Augustus was there and he goes, hey there, random provincial guy. Oh, hi there, Emperor Augustus. Is anything up? Say, you look an awful lot like me. Any chance your mother ever came to Rome? Ha 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 ha. No, but my father came frequently. Oops. Augustus Caesar had a good sense of humor, and it said that he laughed about that. Not so next, some of the people we'll see, and they begin to kind of attack Christians. One of the earliest kind of graffiti that we find on some of the walls is Elemenos worships his god. And it appears that it is the donkey, the image of the donkey from the Passover, who is put on a cross. And so this kind of satire against the Christians begins to come out, this very kind of cool, distorted satire, which we will see really developing in the next couple centuries. If we go quickly to next, the life of Brian by the Monty Python group, there's a wonderful sequence that shows how many people were just following anybody. And so what we find in the Python is Brian is there and he says, you don't need to follow me. You don't need to follow anybody. You've got to think for yourselves. You're all individuals. Yes, we are all individuals. You're all different. Yes, we're all different. I'm not. Now, there is one group that is different from the rest of Rome, and these are the Christians. And so the Christians are going to develop a different kind of laughter, a laughter which recognizes that they are only pilgrims on this earth. Now, the first and the next pilgrim that we look at is the kind of the great Saint Polycarp. Polycarp was kind of a disciple of John, the disciple John, John the Beloved. And he knew him growing up. He was born about 80 AD, and he will become the Bishop of Smyrna. And they began looking, the Romans began looking for people who are Christians, who confess to be Christians, and he hides at first, but then he's brought to the Colosseum. And in the Colosseum, we find him standing up against the emperor. The emperor says, basically, you're an old man. I want to respect your age. Why don't you just deny Christ? Well, what we find next is that he stands in there. He says, how can I deny the God who has taken care of me all of these years? And he says, well, why don't you just kind of avoid the fires? We're going to put you into a pyre and burn you alive. Why don't you just kind of try to escape and deny your Christ? He says, the fires here are so temporary. The fires that you're going to see are much greater. And the emperor is so frustrated. He says, well, why don't you just say, away with the atheists? Now, the Christians were considered atheists because they did not believe in the Roman gods. And so by saying away with the atheists, basically you're saying away with the Christians because they don't believe like other Romans. But Polycarp is so witty. He gets out there in the crowd, he looks up at all of them, and he throws his hand across this whole Colosseum, and he looks at the people and he says, okay, away with those atheists. They're the atheists. Now, what happens next, unfortunately, is he is burned at the stake. But there is this pagan satirist whose name is Lucian. And he says there's something about saints like Polycarp, they're devoted to their Lord, that makes me almost believe in their Christ. And it is said as part of the legend that when he was burnt, one could smell the aroma of bread baking. It's a wonderful aroma. Now, we find next there is another saint we're going to get to, but it deals with how the emperors would always have their own actors. Now, an actor comes from the word hypocrite, to play a part. And so hypocrites and actors are basically the same thing. They are pretending, they're preparing for a part which is not who they really are. And so Nero and Caligula and Diocletian, that we'll see next, really began to kind of pull their actors in. Now, St. Genesius was an amazing man, and he was a pagan, and he had grown up in a Christian environment or known Christian parents, but just really reacted to it, and so became more cynical. And he would basically enact plays for Diocletian. In fact, let me read you a little section from a book that I wrote, sorry, and it is about our friend Genesius. And he's there, and he said, when I heard the name of Christian, it would often make me sick and angry. I would make fun of them and encourage others to abuse them. Over and over, I insulted them and encouraged them to be violent towards them. So I hated Christians, that I deserted my own family as a child when I realized that there were Christians among us. Now, what had happened was he was in a play and mocking baptism. And the priest would come in, pour water over. He says, oh, I wish to die a Christian, you fools. And the emperor laughed. He thought it was really funny. And so did Genesius. He was playing it up. But what happened then, he ironically quipped, I wish to receive the grace of Christ. I long to be reborn and set free from the sin that lies around me. But what happened was he all of a sudden had a vision. And in the vision, he saw himself right before God, the tribunal there, and he saw his sins. And suddenly he changed. He says, no, I really want to be a Christian. Diocletian laughed even harder. He poured wine for everyone. He says, this guy is really good. He says, no, I really believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that he is the Christ. And everyone was going berserk and just thinking, he's so funny. He's really playing this up. But Genesius stepped out and he said, no, I am now a Christian. I believe in this. And so we next see him kind of standing forth and saying that I am not acting anymore, but like Saul on the road to Damascus, I see God's grace coming in. Now, what that did to him, however, was he lost his head laughing. The emperor would come and cut his head off. And so he becomes the patron saint of actors, Saint Genesius. In fact, you could then see that there is a church next in St. Mary's of the Angels in Los Angeles. And this church is a wonderful church dedicated to Saint Genesius. Another saint would also become a martyr, much like Saint Genesius. And this was a young man named Justin. And Justin was brilliant. Justin knew all about Greek philosophy. He knew so many other things. And what he would do, he would defend Christians against certain accusations. And there would be kind of the cynics and the satirists who would mock Christianity for certain things. For example, they would call Christians incestuous. Why incestuous? Because brothers were to kiss one another. Sisters and brothers were to kiss each other. And so they played off this idea that they didn't understand that Christian fellowship was made of brothers and sisters in the family of God. Christians were also accused of being atheists because, as we mentioned, they did not believe in the Roman gods. And they were also accused of being cannibals. Cannibals in the sense that they would eat the flesh and drink the blood of their God, Jesus Christ. And this Eucharist became kind of a symbol that really disturbed people, and that's why they called them cannibals. Now, what we see with Justin, however, is the next thing is he was very sarcastic himself. He lacked tact. He was a young, brash, kind of teenage type who was brilliant and knew it and very witty. And so he would basically ridicule the Caesar or the emperor to whom he was talking. He said, Caesar, you idiot. Nah, not strong enough. Look, you lame brain. Better. And so he lacked that kind of wisdom and tact. But we see next that when he did stand before them, he's going to die young and he's going to get the name Martyr, Justin Martyr there. But he came before the emperor and he basically said, Christians are good citizens. They support you. They pray for you. They are civil, peaceful. They believe in a loving God. And they got little halos. This all may be true, but we've been getting a lot of complaints about those halos. Did I mention to you, Emperor, that you're an idiot? Did I mention to you that you're going to have no head? And so it's really kind of a comic man who stands up here, this young man, Justin. And he will become a martyr, unfortunately. But he will defend the faith with a lot of wit and humor. Next, we go down to Alexandria, and we see Clement of Alexandria, who was one of the great teachers of the early church in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries. Influenced by Aristotle, he believed very much in reason and looking at how we could take Greek philosophy into our faith. But he was worried as well about laughter. And he said, the sudden loss of control over one's composure, particularly in the case of women, is called a giggle. And it's also called the laughter of harlots. And in the case of men, a guffaw, the laughter of idle suitors, offensive to the ear. And yet in his book on the Educator, he sought to teach Christians how to speak, how to walk, how to dress, and even how to laugh. And he says there are two kinds of laughter, the laughter of the whores and the laughter of the wise. And so the early church is recognizing there is a kind of laughter that is good. Now, Clement wrote next on the relationship between Isaac and Jesus. And he said, the word Isaac, I connect with laughter. In fact, the word Isaac in Hebrew, Ishak, means laughter. And so he connects laughter and the name Isaac. He then goes on to interpret this kind of laughter as the joy of Christians, because we rejoice in the salvation offered by Christ. He said that which was signified by the prophet may be interpreted differently. Namely, it is we who now rejoice and laugh on account of the salvation given to us. We are like Isaac. He too laughed after he had been delivered from Akedah, this binding, when he was bound by his father Abraham. He was delivered from death. While Isaac, unlike Jesus, did not suffer death nor resurrection, He represents a type that we are to join in. Now, the next saint that we see was not martyred. He was worse. He was a lawyer. But he became one of the most brilliant, witty people out there, one of the most caustic as well. He will become an apologist, and he is also the father of Latin theology. He will give us, in fact, the word Trinity, that we understand the relationship among the Godhead. He was also the Don Rickles of Christian satire. He was brutal, and he wrote against spectacles and mimes because at the time there was the Arian controversy. And the Arian controversy said that Jesus was really not quite God. And they were people who would use songs and ditties, they pop songs, they would make up music, they would use mimes and gestures in church. And he attacked this kind of entertainment churches that were there. And then he looked at their kind of happy little God and he said, oh yeah, you've got one of the best gods you could get, he said sarcastically. He never gets upset, he never takes offense, never gets angry, never punishes anybody. Oh, he forbids all crimes, but he says, oh, only with words, tit, tit, tit. He says, basically, there's no problem. He's a nice God. He's a fangless God. He's not a God of justice. And so this kind of sarcasm would come out. In fact, one of his other kind of great lines that he had to someone, that someone complained they had no other way of living except cheating other people. And he says, well, do you have to live? We don't need you. And so he begins to kind of attack the immorality of people around him. One of his next kind of great lines was when people were saying that whenever there was a catastrophe, it was the problem of Christians because they weren't worshiping the Roman gods. So his great quote was, if the Tiber River floods the city, or if the Nile refuses to rise, or if a sky even withholds its rain, if there's an earthquake, a famine, a pestilence, all at once the cry is raised, Christians are at fault. Send Christians to the lion. What? So many Christians to one lion? And he would use this kind of humor and wit to attack his foes. He did next, however, have kind of a strange view of women. And on one particular woman, he said, you are the doorway to the devil. And that has a lot of implications, which we will not go into. But in church history, if you look at different saints and their perspective of women, he will be at the bottom. And so he will not be kind of a hero of feminists. But next we see that he did have laughter, some biting, brilliant sarcasm. Looking at the spectacles of Rome, of the Colosseum and everything else, he says, what kind of spectacles do I laugh at? What sight gives me joy? I see so many great kings groaning now in the lowest darkness. They're in the inferno. The governors of provinces who persecuted the Christian name, they're in fires now more fierce than the ones that they proudly threatened the followers of Christ with. And we go next, he continues, and he says, basically, I'm laughing at the damned who are suffering in hell. At the greatest of all spectacles, the last and end of eternal judgment, how shall I admire, how I shall laugh, how I shall rejoice, how exult when I behold so many proud monarchs groaning in the lowest abyss of darkness. So many magistrates liquefying in fiercer flames than were ever kindled against the Christians. So many sage philosophers blushing in red-hot fires with their deluded pupils. So many tragedians more tuneful in their expression of pain in their real suffering now. So many dancers tripping more nimbly from anguish than ever before from applause. And so he has this very kind of dark, morbid view of what's going to happen to the damned. It's not something that we would recommend, but it's something you can understand when you see the persecution going around you and you realize the judgment comes upon. There's next kind of a comic moment that we can find in a play. Dionysius asked to see the wicked in hell himself. And how he was answered was with a gesture pointing at the audience who was watching his own play. He says, was told, these people are suffering as if they're in hell. And it's like people watching a PowerPoint lecture. you may be in hell right now. You may be suffering as much as that poor audience. Next, we move to one of the great critics of Christianity, kind of the George Carlin or the Bill Maher, who looked and began to kind of say, look at all the things that are wrong. And Celsus in the 2nd century was one of the great critics, and he was kind of mean-spirited and cruel, but he was fairly accurate on certain things, as we'll find out. He would start off talking, he says, let's assume for the present that Jesus foretold his resurrection. Are you ignorant and stupid of all the multitudes who have invented similar tales to lead simple-minded hearers astray? What about Orpheus? Doubtless you will freely admit that these other stories are legends, even as they appear to me. But you go on to say that your resurrection story, this climax to your tragedy of Jesus on the cross, is actually believable and noble. Now, there were people that knew the disciples and apostles who were still claiming the resurrection had happened, and there were firsthand witnesses that they were able to pass on. But he had this doubt and this cynicism. And so when you begin to look at some of the arguments Celsus had, you look at this list that we present next. He basically said, this was right after the death of Justin Martyr, and he says, first of all, God's just basically an angry old man who lives in the sky. And this is what many kind of modern cynics have kind of imitated Celsus on some of these things. And he says Jesus was born of a Roman soldier's adultery with Mary. And so he's really scandalizing everything going on because he has no belief. Then he gets to say that Jesus was too poor to be divine. Because look at the Roman emperors who claim divinity. And they have power and glory and wealth. And to be a god, you had to have all of those things. And Jesus did these magic acts. His miracles were nothing more than tricks. Then he begins to attack his followers, the disciples. He says they're ignorant, they're uneducated, and they're unpatriotic. And here he is right. What is really interesting is that he is capturing the nature of who Jesus was and what he came to do. But his great attack is on women. And you begin to realize how Christianity was really had a much more liberal perspective on women than the Romans did. He said the first women witnesses of the resurrection were women who are hysterical and untrustworthy. Roman law would not let women be witnesses and give their testimony in trials. But Christians based much of their faith on the credibility of these early women, of Mary and the other women. And then he says Christians were too accepting of sinners. So in this sense, he understood Christian theology, that the followers, the disciples, were not learned. They were not wise in the ways of the world. And they would accept anyone who confessed their sins. And so Celsus was right on these things. But he says Christians are basically like a council of frogs. They're in a marsh croaking that for our sakes, this world was created. And that's so true. And so he caught certain truths of this. Well, next we find that Celsus was really, his arguments were developed by Origen of Alexandria, who is one of the great minds of the early church. And what we know about Celsus came from Origen, where he wrote his book against Celsus. And he described a lot of these arguments, and then he would go against each one of them in detail and refute them. And so he says Celsus is basically kind of a fundamentalist and doesn't understand things. When you think you have a talking snake in the Garden of Eden, you don't really understand what the story is all about. And so Origen was able to kind of bring a different perspective for the Christian truth. The next we find that Origen goes also back to the miraculous birth of Isaac. And he says there's several parallels between Isaac, this laughter, and Christ. He says, first we have the miraculous birth. Isaac was born to Sarah, who was 90 years old. And we remember the cry of both Sarah and Mary, Quomodo, how can this be? And so both of them are seeing how miraculous it is. And so Isaac is a type. Isaac also had to carry the wood for his sacrifice up to Mount Moriah. And so Jesus carrying his own cross, this wood is there. And then we have basically the idea of a sacrifice, where Abraham is to sacrifice his only son, but he doesn't. He is spared, and a ram is given. And yet, God the Father is called to sacrifice his only son, the Lamb of God, and he goes through with it for our sake. But for Origen, Isaac means the laughter and the joy that comes with this resurrection. Now, this leads us to a kind of a really early problem in the church, and that was Docetism. Docetism was the heresy, and heresy means another opinion. It was another kind of idea about what Christianity is about that happened in the 2nd century. And Docetism means that Jesus only seemed to be God. God only seemed to be human. Christ only appeared to have a human body. He only seemed to be human. Jesus's body was only psychic. It wasn't real. And this is where we find the Apostle John in his first epistle saying, no, what we have seen, what we have handled, what we have heard concerning the Word of God, this Jesus we touched, we held with our own hands, and we know that he had a body. But the Spirit of Christ, according to this Docetism, left Jesus just before the cross. In fact, we find in a Gnostic work called the Apocalypse of Peter that Jesus leaves the crucifixion, and it is Simon of Cyrene who carries his cross and gets on the cross himself and dies in his place. And Jesus is up above, Christ is up above, looking down at Simon's feet being hammered, his hands being nailed, and he's laughing and glad looking at this sacrifice. And so this idea that Jesus just seemed to die is part of Docetism. But for the Christian, Jesus did die. There is a complete death that is there. What is interesting that in the Quran, they pick up this idea of Docetism, that someone else will die in Jesus' place. And so the laughter is there, but it is not kind of a genuine laughter. Next, we go to a couple saints who were comic and who brought kind of laughter into the church. One of the first, during the persecution in 258, the persecution by Emperor Valerian, who is beginning to confiscate all the property of the church because he realizes the Christians are very generous, they give to feed the poor, and the church collects all of this and it begins to distribute it to others. And St. Lawrence is there, and he tells St. Lawrence, I want you to gather all the treasures of the church and bring them to me. So Emperor Valerian is kind of looking forward to this kind of great cache of gold and silver and everything else that's going to come his way. But what happens next is kind of funny. St. Lawrence fools Valerian with the treasures of the church because he brings the treasures of God as the crippled, the poor, the blind, the indigent, the needy, those whom God treasures. These precious and peculiar treasures of God are these people. And so when he brings them to the Emperor Valerian, Valerian, of course, next goes furious. And he gets this red hot gridiron and he puts Lawrence on it. And they hold him down with iron forks. And Lawrence says, I want to offer myself up as a sacrifice to God, a sweet aroma, an odor of sweetness. And so as we found with Polycarp, who's smelled of this kind of wonderful aroma of fresh baked bread, we find also with St. Lawrence, this idea that you're sacrificing yourself as an aroma to God, this fragrance to God. And so next we find that he has some other humor, that when he's being burned on this grid, he raises his eyes to his judge and he says, well, looks like this side is well roasted. You want to turn me over before you eat me. And this next leads us to kind of what we discover about him when after he says, turn me over, he becomes the patron saint of cooks, of chefs, and comedians. He is there even at his death using humor. And we're going to find this with other saints who die later on. Sir Thomas More and others who use humor at this time of suffering and the time of their death. Now next we see that during this time, because of the persecutions, because of what we'll see as an ascetic influence, this kind of denial of the body during this time. There are those saints who are against laughter. And one of them is the great Cappadocian father, Basil the Great. And he comes out and he is educated in Greek rhetoric. He understands persuasion. He is a man of the world. And yet his sister and his brother and his friend, they all come together to kind of create this wonderful Orthodox community. But he warns that we must not indulge in jesting. We must not, as Christians, laugh or even suffer laugh makers, because they realize how serious is their calling. And sometimes there are people around who are too frivolous. They are just playing with being Christians. And he's saying, no, it is a time for gravitas. It's a time to be serious about all of this. One of the key people who did this is next St. John Chrysostom, who becomes the great Archbishop of Constantinople, who's exiled a couple times back and forth to Constantinople because of his preaching. He is called the Golden Mouth because he has off his lips such wonderful, precious words that are so powerful. In one of his homilies, he denounces corrupt clergy. And remember, this is after the time of Constantine, who's come and gone and Christianized the whole Roman Empire. And the problem when Christianity becomes the dominant religion is that it becomes lax and people become corrupt and people become spoiled and lazy. And so he looks at the debauchery of some of the clergy, and he goes against all the circuses that people are presenting and the theaters that they're beginning to kind of imitate the Roman culture again. And the church is becoming coterminous with the world. And he says, Christ is crucified, and yet you're still going to laugh? You don't realize what he has done for us. The next thing he develops is this kind of idea that laughter needs to be denied because it is going to be deferred. And one thing we saw last week was when Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton, says the one thing we really haven't seen in the life of Jesus is his mirth, because we're waiting for that. It is yet to come. And so we need to hold off laughter until the Lord's return. And so this is something that St. Chrysostom picks up. And he writes in one of his statutes, he says, to laugh, for example, to speak jocosely does not seem to acknowledge sin, but it leads to sin. Thus, laughter often gives birth to foul discourse. And foul discourse leads to actions that are even more foul. Often from words and laughter proceeds railing and insult. And then, once we insult one another, we begin to blow and fight and wound each other. And from that, we slaughter and murder. If then you would take good counsel for yourself, avoid not merely foul words and foul deeds, or blows, wounds, and murders, but unseasonable laughter itself, and the very language of raillery, since these things have proved the root of subsequent evils. Now, what we see next is that St. Chrysostom has really developed the idea of the domino theory of laughter. And I don't completely buy it, but we see that he sees in some people this movement from just laughing and making fun to fighting to killing each other. But he does recognize that laughter is not a sin, but it can lead to sin. And this is what we have to watch out for. But he also recognizes that laughter has been implanted in our soul, that the soul may sometime be refreshed. He sees that there is good in laughter. And one of the best places to find laughter, he says, is when we celebrate Easter. And that is the next bit of laughter. He says, at Easter, everyone rejoices. The risus paschalis, the laughter of the Passover, the laughter of the Easter. And he gave an Easter homily, a little Easter sermon. And one thing about homilies that you have to recognize, sermons back then, sermo, S-E-R-M-O, means chat. It's a small sermon like we have today. Today we have long homilies. Back then, sermons could be really short, and those were probably the best ones. But he said in his Easter homily, he says, hell was in an uproar because it was done away with. Hell was upset because it was mocked. It was laughed at. Now, where it was laughed at next is we come to one of the great monks of the time, Evagrius Ponticus, Ponticus meaning the bridge. He will kind of take us over to good laughter. He's a Cenobitic monk, and a Cenobitic means a communal monk, a monk who lives with other monks instead of a solitary monk. There were Egyptian monks who would go off and live by themselves, sometimes on pillars, but he had these monks living together in community. The problem of living together in community is you're living together in community. There are other people who begin to kind of irritate you and annoy you in different ways. And so what he saw, he said, when you're living in community, there are kind of 8 patterns of evil thoughts that are going to tempt you to get upset. These are spiritual stumbling blocks, he said, and we have to realize that they're there to take us away from our devotion to God. And so he said that the problems monks have are these 8 things: gluttony, lust, greed, sadness, acedia or sloth, anger, vainglory or pride, and pride. And so he has these 8 things here. Now, later on, Pope Gregory the Great is going to take those 8 and he's going to reduce them to 7. And that's where we'll get our 7 deadly sins. But these 8 begin with Evagrius. The one that Gregory got rid of, which I think is really one of the most important ones, is sadness. And sadness of the soul, said Evagrius, are like fetters on your feet. They're an impediment to your spiritual growth. You cannot walk when you are sad because you become so consumed with yourself. This melancholy it's all about me and what a poor, pitiful creature I am. And the more we would think about ourselves, the more that monks would think about themselves, the farther they're away from thinking about God and thinking about others. When we think about others and seek to make them cheerful, we find that gladness comes to us. Now, what he said next about the ascetic life may fit well with being quarantined today. The idea, he said, if a jar of wine is left in a place a long time, the wine in it becomes very clear, settled, and fragrant. But if the wine is moved around a lot, the wine becomes turbid and dull, tainted throughout by the lees. So you too, he advises, should stay in the same place, and you will find how greatly this benefits you. I think in this time of quarantine, many of us have discovered how wonderful it is not to be rushing about, how wonderful it is to just be at peace and be in a place where you can reflect and meditate, where you can sit quietly with family and just look at each other and laugh. And so this is what Evagrius saw, that sometimes it is good to be still and to know that God is with us. Now, Evagrius would go on, and he would say next that every vice had its own corresponding remedy to help resist it. And so we find for sadness, he defined the great virtue of hilaritas. Hilaritas, meaning cheerfulness, hilarity, merriment. In fact, in the 3rd century of Rome, Hilaritas was a Roman goddess who came out. She was rejoicing and good humor. She even came on coins. But Evagrius would say, happy is the monk who views the welfare and the progress of all people with as much joy as if it were his own. And so Hilaritas is concerned about the cheerfulness of others, about making them happy, about caring for them. And it's one of the greatest antidotes to sadness, is to rejoice in the Lord. And again, I say rejoice, St. Paul says. Now, what Evagrius said next is wonderful. He gave us this wonderful, rich Christian vocabulary of joy. Look at these words of joy. Alacritas, which means cheerfulness. I mean, just to go around with alacritas that is there. You have this on your face. Gaudium, gaudy and glad. You are glad. Letitia, happiness. Jocundus, the fullness of joy, the fullness of laughter. Hilaritas, which we mentioned, just kind of laughing with hilarity. And even the word eutropelia, a good turning. You meaning good, tropelia mean turning. You turn things for goodness. Evagrius says nothing will demoralize a kind of a monastery community as much as a fellow saint with a sad face. There are those wet rag brothers with a long face and a woeful expression who come in and dampen everything that is good. He says, what is needed is a little merriment, a eutropelia, a playfulness, which doesn't contradict the gravitas, the seriousness of the rules of St. Benedict that we'll get to in a while. On the contrary, says, eutropelia allows a man to relax and enables him to persevere your monastic observances over the long haul. It is wonderful refreshment along the trip. Now, if you notice those license plates on the right side of the PowerPoint, jocular, hilaritas, ha 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 times 2, which is ha 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 ha. Those are license plates that I've had on my car. Every time I'm writing a new book, I get a license plate that kind of sparks and propels me to write. And so writing jocular, I was writing kind of the mother of all laughter. Writing hilaritas, I was writing a book on God Mocks. Ha ha times 2 is divine comedy, looking at film. And these license plates were there. Now, the problem is sometimes they don't really quite work. Hilaritas, people thought it meant hilarity and A's, Hillary Clinton, and something along that was really bad. I had one that was senile, and people really kept away from my car. But all of these are there. Ha ha times 2 during a quarantine is not a happy thing. People think I'm cutting in front of them. And so I've got to be very careful about these. And so you've got to control the kind of merriment and jocularity that you give to the world. Otherwise, people will kind of salute you with one finger as they go by. Next, however, we get to a saint who started off as a great sinner. And that's St. Augustine. And St. Augustine studied rhetoric, studied communication like I did, and became kind of a master of it. But he was a sinner, and he recognized himself as a sinner. He had a mother whose name was Monica. And Monica would pray over him every night, and she would weep and weep. And finally, a bishop came and said, listen, don't worry about your son. You've cried for 17 years, and a son of so many tears cannot be lost. He will be found. He will be taken care of by God. And it was in the last years of her life that St. Augustine had been persuaded by St. Ambrose and other saints whom he saw as having just a great spirit of jocularity and of wisdom, and was converted by them. And so his mother's prayers were answered. He became a man of the church. He became a priest and then a bishop. And basically, when his mother died, it inspired him to write his Confessions, which is probably one of the greatest books of Western civilization. The next thing we find is that he begins to reflect on newborn babies. And he believed strongly in original sin. So you realize that for him, babies, when they're first born, are these really totally depraved little sinners. I don't think they become that way until they're 2 or 3, but he saw them early. He said, basically, we can learn a lot from human beings. We're more fitted for tears, he says, than to laughter. I remember his mother had just died, and she spent a lot of her time crying. And so it's very natural that he would see tears. He says, the baby itself wears witness to its wretchedness by crying. It doesn't begin with laughter, but it begins with wailing. It could have just as well have laughed, but tears come first. In this way, the child becomes a prophet of its own future misfortunes, which beset all human beings who live in the midst of trials and temptations. So he sees that our life right now after the fall is one burst of tears. We are people who are going to suffer. We are going to go through tribulations. And he recognizes this is the state of us after the fall. But Augustine says we are sinners, and so we have to weep first. And he confessed that he was so great a sinner for so small a boy. What we see next then is that he was a sinner because early on he would just steal pears for the fun of it, and he would throw them at pigs. Now, some pigs need to have pears thrown at them, but he would just waste good food. And so he recognized all of his little piggy pears that he would throw were something about himself, something that was not good. In fact, the other thing that we see next is that he loved sex, and he had a mistress, and he had a child out of wedlock when he was still kind of a pagan. And he would pray for chastity, but he would pray that it wouldn't be given yet. It was like a Saturday night. He was with a very attractive woman, and he says, can it wait till tomorrow morning? And so you see, here is a man who, like others in the church, St. Jerome, St. Wolfston, would wrestle with his lust. And it was there until he was in his late 30s, struggling with this. And even then, it was something that was so genuine to him. But he recognized it as one of those sins that Evagrius talked about, and he needed self-discipline. But he became a Christian, and he began to kind of work next with understanding God. And he would write books on the city of God. What it does it mean to live with God? And once he remembers kind of a story, he's troubled about trying to understand the Trinity. And so he's walking along the seashore, and he sees this small little child playing in the sand, digging a hole, and then going to the sea and putting a spoonful of water from the sea and bringing it over to his hole and dipping it in. And he looks, he says, what are you doing? And the child says, I mean to empty the sea into my little hole. And he keeps going back and forth. And Augustine, now the Bishop of Hippo, says, it's impossible, child. And the little child looks up at him and says, not more impossible than that thy human mind should understand the complete mind of God. And this humbles the great bishop. And he realizes that the child vanished, that God sent him to an answer. That there are times that even though we seek with all of our mind and heart, there are times we just trust with God and we enjoy what God is doing. Now, next we find that for Augustine, he develops this theological model of God's laughter. And he sees the triumph of God's mercy over wickedness as something we can rejoice in. Now, he's not in dark and sarcastic as Tertullian was, laughing at all those people in hell. But he says there are things that we can laugh at. There are things that we overcome and we can enjoy. In his Confessions, he actually shows two kinds of laughter. There is this merciless laughter where we're going to become dust and ashes and we give up all hope. It's like a hopeless laughter. But then there is a merciful laughter, the laughter of heaven. And we can see that God is working in our lives. In fact, the great joke he sees is this next one, that John Chrysostom also saw, and so did other church fathers. And this is called the divine mousetrap. It's also known as the bait on the divine fishhook. Augustine said, the devil rejoiced when Christ died. He thought he had won. He had killed God. And so he is just rejoicing with all of his demons in hell. But, Augustine says, it is this very death of Christ that vanquishes the devil. The devil took the bait of Christ's death. He stepped into the mousetrap. He took the cheese that said, okay, with the cross, I'm going to get rid of God once and for all and damn the rest of his people. But the cross was the Lord's mousetrap. The bait by which he caught was the Lord's death. And so this wonderful kind of image that we get of the mousetrap where God fools the devil completely. The best way to look at that next is Augustine saying essentially the joke is on the devil. And the joke on the devil is the Easter laugh, risus paschalis. Throughout the Middle Ages, in fact, when a priest would give a homily on Easter, it had to contain a story that made people laugh. And so that the church, will find out in the Middle Ages, is a church full of mirth and gladness and laughter. Next, however, we get, though, to the 5th century. The Goths have come, the Vandals have come, everybody has come, and they're destroying everything. And there's the ecclesiastical reproofs, and there's kind of a physical punishment that comes with us in the anonymous Regula Patrium Serapionius. And in this kind of set of rules, any monk who succumbs to laughter is going to be given 2 weeks of the scourge of humility, flagella humilitas, or 1 day in New Jersey. Now, you didn't realize that is in one of the old manuscripts, but if you look closely, you'll find things that are so odd and so wonderful and so bizarre. But I'm kidding, of course. The next we get to one ascetic who was a disciple of Evagrius. And his fellow monks would be really shocked when he would jest, when he would laugh with everyone else. And he explained laughter is like entering the human soul like an archer's bow. We must not be continually taut and tight. The mind and the soul needs that which is funny, that which makes us laugh, that which is ridiculous to loosen, because if we become too taut, we will break. The small and brief recreations, the recreating of our minds should not offend, and we should laugh. And so here are the monks who become We Are the Monkeys, that old television show. I'm sorry, we'll move on next. The last saint we're going to look at is Saint Jerome. He is the most irascible, cantankerous, cranky, grumpy old saint that ever existed. He is the one, however, to whom we are indebted because he translated the Bible into the common Latin language, the Vulgate. What we see next in his life was he was also a student of rhetoric, and he had studied Cicero and Quintilian and the pagan classics for pleasure until he had a dream that turned him from some of these pagan sources, at least for a little while. In a letter, he describes how during an illness, he dreamed he was standing before the tribunal of Christ. And Christ came down, he says, "Are you a Christian? Ha! No, you're a Ciceronian. Because where your treasure is, where you spend your time, that's where your heart is also." And so he recognized even more that he had to move into the Christian faith. And so he devoted his studies to understanding the Greek and the Hebrew and translating it into the Latin so everyone in the Roman Empire could read it. The next thing we see is that St. Jerome is in his study, creating the Versio Vulgate, or basically it looks like he's preparing a very long PowerPoint lecture that is going to put many people to sleep. But the problem with Jerome is he was seen as very vain, hard-headed, horny, and downright crabby. And that was by his friends. He scolded other monks as windbags. And to one young monk who wanted to leave the monastery, he said, "Do you want to go back to your mother's sagging breasts to hear her hum another nursery lullaby? Grow up." He says, "My satire, I can bite. I leave tooth marks when I say different things." In fact, next we find that his tongue was particularly acidic at times. He would attack the indulgences of an accuser, because all you would do is quaff wine and belch as you stuff yourself with duck and sturgeon. "My fellows and I are content to fill my bellies with water and beans," which will lead to another joke, but we'll wait for the Middle Ages for that. But let's look next at some of the phrases that he translated and see how he translated the Vulgate, the vulgar, which means common, into things that are vulgar. In Ezekiel, he wrote that the knees of marching men will run with water. In other words, they're going to be so scared, they're going to piss in their tunics. In Isaiah, he talks about, in Ezekiel, he talks about how Israel will lust after the large genitals of donkeys and the emission of mules. That's not a typical Sunday morning sermon that you hear. It might be very interesting, but it's not one we hear. From Isaiah, he hears translates the verse, "Throw away your idols like menstrual rags." And then in Philippians, he translates Paul, "I count all things as dung," scubala. Scubala basically means bad words. And so he is using common vulgar language to get across how our own righteousness is as a menstrual rag or as dung. I want to end kind of next with this kind of debate from Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, because it'll capture what we're going to be looking at next week, and people are debating the humanity of Jesus Christ. Remember we talked about Docetism, how God just seemed to be human. But here it is, if God is fully human, did he have a body and did he laugh? And so there are two monks in Umberto Eco's mystery novel, and they're going to debate the idea of laughter. The first is the Dominican Jorge. And Dominicans, of course, were from St. Dominic, who was called the Dog of God. He was a great teacher. He was learned. He did many miracles. He tried to persuade heretics out of heresies. But the Dominicans are also those people who institute the Inquisition. They're going to be very tough, as opposed to the Franciscans, where we have the Franciscan William. And St. Francis, of course, was a very gentle man who loved life that was there. And so the Dominican, Jorge, says, John Chrysostom said that Christ never laughed. And the Franciscan William, played by Sean Connery, or James Bond, Franciscan William says, nothing in human nature forbade laughter, because laughter, as the theologians teach, is proper and natural to man. And Jorge says, the Son of Man could laugh, but it is not written that he did so. Next, he continues, laughter is a devilish wind, which deforms the lineaments of the face and makes men look like monkeys. We become grimacing creatures. And William of Baskerville, the Franciscan, says, monkeys don't laugh. Laughter is particular to men. Jorge, the Dominican, says, as his sin, Christ never laughed. But William says, can we be so